A senior Russian diplomat, not a blogger, not a military commentator, not a fringe voice, sat across from a camera and said something that no one in Western media is treating with the seriousness it deserves. He said the moment of direct confrontation between Russia and the West is approaching very much. He said Europe has already crossed all the red lines. He said Russia's self-restraint is not unlimited, and he would not advise anyone to test it. And then he said the most important thing of all, the thing that explains every other statement he made. Russia is not fighting Ukraine. Russia is fighting NATO. Ukraine is a tool, a private military company in his exact framing. The real adversary, the entity that is providing the weapons, the targeting intelligence, the airspace, the drone production facilities, the long-range missiles that can only be operated with Western specialist approval, is the NATO military bloc, primarily its European component. That framing is not a rhetorical flourish. It is the operational framework through which Moscow is calculating what comes next, and what comes next based on the specific language of a career diplomat with decades of experience who chooses his words with the precision that the diplomatic profession demands is not a continuation of the current status quo. Russia fired the Sarmat ICBM. It has activated orbital anti-satellite systems. It is stockpiling Shahed drones at a rate that exceeds anything it has deployed in Ukraine. It has built a 70,000-strong military corps in the St. Petersburg district positioned directly across from Finland. And its permanent representative to the OCE is using language that describes European capitals as legitimate targets for Russian response, not as a threat, but as a logical consequence of choices Europe has already made. I am Colonel Douglas Macgregor. This is Global Insight Network. Today, I am going to walk through exactly what the Russian diplomatic position actually says, what the Sarmat test actually signals, why the European escalation pattern has created a strategic problem that Russia describes as unsustainable, and what the two scenarios Russia has identified for how this ends look like operationally. Stay with me. This is the most direct diplomatic signal Russia has sent since the conflict began, the Sarmat test and what it is not. Let me start with the Sarmat test because the Western framing of it, Putin flexing muscles, saber rattling, a desperate attempt to intimidate, misses the specific message it was designed to deliver. The Sarmat ICBM was not a surprise development. It was announced approximately 10 years ago as part of a comprehensive modernization program that Putin presented publicly. That presentation named specific systems, the Kinzhal hypersonic missile, the Zircon, the Poseidon nuclear-capable underwater drone, and the Sarmat, and gave timelines for their development. The test is the completion of a declared program, not an improvisation. The significance of the Sarmat is not its existence. Russia has had nuclear weapons for 7 decades. It is the specific capability it represents in the current strategic environment. The United States withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty in the early 2000s. That withdrawal triggered a Russian decision to develop systems that could defeat whatever missile defense architecture the United States chose to build. The Sarmat, with its ability to approach targets via unpredictable trajectories, including polar routes from the south, is specifically designed to render American missile defense investments irrelevant to the nuclear deterrence equation. The timing of the test is a message to the conversation that is happening in Western capitals about what happens if the conflict in Ukraine reaches a phase where Russian conventional military victory is imminent. There has been discussion in those capitals, some of it public, some of it leaked, about what direct NATO military involvement might look like in a final phase scenario. The Sarmat test is Russia's answer to that discussion. It is saying the conversation you are having about direct military intervention assumes that Russian nuclear capability is a manageable factor. The test is demonstrating that this assumption is wrong. This is not weakness. It is the opposite. A weak power does not have a working Sarmat. A weak power does not test it in the middle of an active conventional conflict. A weak power does not use it to open a specific strategic communication with the adversary at the exact moment when that communication is most relevant to decisions being made in Washington and European capitals. The Sarmat test is the nuclear dimension of a broader Russian strategic communication that the diplomatic statements have been expressing in conventional terms, the escalation pattern and the Russian reading of it. Let me walk through the specific escalation pattern that Russia is describing because understanding the sequence from the Russian perspective is essential for understanding why the current moment is different from what came before. The pattern the West has established across 4 years of this conflict is consistent and documented. A new capability is proposed for Ukrainian deployment. Russia warns against it. Western officials debate whether the delivery would trigger escalation. The delivery happens. Russia does not immediately escalate dramatically. Western officials conclude that the red line was not actually a red line. The next capability is proposed. Artillery, then heavier artillery, then tanks, then longer-range missiles, then F-16s, which President Biden called a World War III risk, and then approved anyway. Each time, the conclusion in Western capitals was that Russia's warnings were bluster and that the red lines were fictional. The Russian diplomatic reading of this pattern is specific. It is not that Russia failed to enforce its red lines. It is that Russia made a strategic choice to create space for diplomacy, to demonstrate through self-restraint that it preferred negotiation to escalation and to give the Western side a window to engage seriously before forcing the issue militarily. That strategic choice from the Russian perspective was systematically exploited. The restraint was read as inability. The diplomatic space was not used for negotiation. The weapons deliveries continued. The targeting assistance continued. Western countries gave Ukraine the airspace for drones that struck refineries in St. Petersburg's region. Western countries are producing Ukrainian drones and military equipment on their own territory. Western personnel are required to operate certain Western missile systems that are being used to strike Russian territory. The Russian position is that this sequence has moved past the point of proxy conflict and into direct participation in a war against Russia, not because any single Western action explicitly constitutes a declaration of war, but because the cumulative effect of the Western contribution, targeting, equipment, logistics, airspace, personnel means that NATO is functionally a co-belligerent in a conflict against Russia. And the specific development that the Russian diplomat identifies as having changed the calculus is the strikes on Russian energy infrastructure, oil refineries, processing facilities, infrastructure whose damage has economic consequences that are visible in Russian domestic conditions. The strikes on Russian energy infrastructure are not tactical gains in the conventional military sense. They are strategic attacks on the Russian domestic economy. When you hit an oil refinery, you are not affecting the front line in Ukraine. You are affecting Russian energy production, Russian export revenue, and Russian industrial capacity. This is a qualitative change in what the conflict is, and Russia's position is that it requires a qualitative change in Russia's response, the Ukrainian manpower crisis, and what it reveals. Let me address the Ukrainian battlefield situation, specifically the manpower dimension, because it is the factor that Western analysis most consistently underweights, and that Russia most specifically identifies as defining the conflict's trajectory. Russia's assessment is that Ukrainians are increasingly not willing to fight. This is not a Russian propaganda point. It is documented in Ukrainian domestic media, in the forced conscription legislation that Western sponsors required as a condition of new funding, in the discussions about lowering the conscription age, in the discussion about conscripting women. The mobilization law that was passed under explicit Western pressure as a condition for continued support reflects the recognition by Ukraine's sponsors that the voluntary military recruitment model has been exhausted. The people who were willing to fight for the cause have largely already been mobilized, wounded, or killed. What remains requires compulsion. There are documented accounts on Ukrainian social media, in Ukrainian journalistic reporting, in international media of men being apprehended in streets, in markets, at transportation hubs, and forcibly inducted into military service. These accounts are not Russian propaganda. They are Ukrainian-produced content that reflects the domestic reality of a mobilization system under extreme stress. The contrast with the Russian side is operationally significant. Russia is still fielding primarily volunteer forces in its primary combat units. This is not permanent. Russia has expanded its military significantly and is drawing on a broader population base than pure volunteers. But the morale differential between a force where people chose to be there and a force where people were compelled to be there is documented throughout military history. Morale affects combat effectiveness in ways that equipment comparisons cannot capture. A soldier who wants to be in the fight will hold a position that a soldier who is dragged off the street will abandon. The battlefield reports of Ukrainian position abandonment, again documented in Ukrainian sources, not Russian claims, reflect this morale differential in operational terms. Europe's willingness to continue funding a war that requires forcing its own nominal beneficiaries into service against their will is something Russia characterizes explicitly as treating Ukraine as a human buffer, not as a country whose sovereignty and people matter, as a buffer, a zone of expendable human beings positioned between NATO and Russia. Whether that characterization is harsh or accurate is a matter of perspective. What it is not is strategic incoherence. It describes the operational function that Ukraine currently serves in Western strategic planning with more honesty than most Western official communications do. The direct confrontation question and what the diplomat actually said. Let me address the core diplomatic signal directly because the specific formulation used by Russia's OSCE permanent representative is more significant than the way Western media treated it. The question was direct. Is it possible that Russia could strike targets in Western Europe? The answer was constructed very carefully. Not a denial, not a threat, something more precise than either. Russia has not responded to Western escalation, the diplomat said, because Russia is human. Because Russia thinks about the future of European citizens who would be devastated by the consequences. The restraint is not weakness. It is a choice made specifically to avoid catastrophic harm to European populations who are being kept ignorant of the risks their governments are creating for them. But, and this is the operative part, if Russian vital interests are genuinely threatened, there will be no hesitation. The nuclear doctrine is open and public. Everyone knows the circumstances under which those weapons would be used. The military has cards to play that it has not played. There are reasons it has not played them. Those reasons will not remain operative indefinitely if the current trajectory continues. He then specifically declined to say whether there would be an ultimatum or a sudden response. He said instead, "Do not test the limits of our patience and self-restraint." This is diplomatic language calibrated to convey maximum clarity without triggering the kind of crisis response that a direct threat would require. He is not threatening, he is describing, he is informing the Western side of a logical consequence that the current trajectory produces and advising against allowing that trajectory to continue. The distinction matters because it tells you what Russia wants the other side to do with the information. Russia is not trying to provoke, it is trying to deter. The message is understand what you are moving toward and change course before you arrive. The specific framing about Europe already having crossed all the red lines is the most operationally significant statement, because if Europe has already crossed the red lines, if the provision of targeting assistance, the airspace for drones striking Russian territory, the production of Ukrainian military equipment on European soil, the personnel operating Western missile systems, if all of that already constitutes crossing red lines, then the question of what triggers a Russian response is no longer about what Europe might do in the future. It is about when Russia decides the accumulated crossings require a response. The two scenarios and why neither is comfortable. Russia has presented two scenarios for how this conflict resolves. Let me examine each with the specificity that the current moment requires. Scenario 1. Russian military victory through continued conventional campaign. Russia assessed this as the more probable scenario. Ukrainian military manpower crisis is not recoverable on any timeline shorter than years of forced conscription that produces forces with fundamentally different morale characteristics than what is currently fighting. The attrition rate of Ukrainian military equipment, armored vehicles, air defense interceptors, artillery has exceeded Western production capacity to replenish it. The economic cost of the conflict, Ukraine's infrastructure, is cumulative and compounding. Russian forces are advancing. The pace is not the sweeping movements that some Western commentators expect to see before concluding that advances are happening. It is methodical, sustained pressure against fortified positions that were built over more than a decade specifically to resist Russian advances. The Donbas fortifications represent 10 years of Ukrainian and NATO advisory investment in defensive preparation. Breaking through them methodically rather than rashly is a deliberate operational choice, not a limitation. The trajectory: slower manpower replenishment on the Ukrainian side, higher volunteer rates on the Russian side, continued Russian equipment production outpacing Western resupply. Systematic degradation of Ukrainian defensive infrastructure, points toward a conventional military outcome that resolves the war on Russian terms. Scenario 2, Western policy change and genuine diplomatic engagement. Russia assessed this as very unlikely given current European political behavior, but it identified what it would look like. European governments would need to acknowledge that the current trajectory, treating Ukraine as a buffer zone and sacrificing Ukrainian lives for a strategic objective that protects no European vital interest, is not sustainable. They would need to cease the weapons deliveries, the targeting assistance, the airspace provision, the drone production, and the Western personnel operating military systems. And they would need to engage in a genuine diplomatic process that takes Russian security interests into account rather than treating Russian interests as irrelevant to any settlement framework. The specific Russian demand embedded in this scenario is significant. Russia is not asking for European surrender or for European acknowledgement of Russian superiority. It is asking for a security architecture that includes Russian interests, indivisible security, in the specific Russian phrase, a framework that cannot be constructed at Russia's expense. This is not an irrational demand. It is the demand that serious diplomatic frameworks, the ones that produce stable security arrangements after major conflicts throughout modern history, have been built on. Settlement frameworks that one party is designed to lose do not produce stability. They produce the conditions for the next conflict. Europe has been designing the Ukraine settlement framework entirely around Russian loss. Russia is saying this will not work, and the alternative, it is describing a settlement that actually works because it includes Russian security interests, is the only one that produces a stable outcome. The European propaganda environment and its consequences. Let me address something that the Russian diplomat raised that deserves direct examination: the specific quality of European diplomatic engagement and what it means for the prospects of Scenario 2. His characterization of his European counterparts at the OCE as propagandists rather than diplomats is not diplomatic venting. It is an operational observation about the quality of engagement that is available for producing the kind of outcome that Scenario 2 would require. Diplomacy, the professional practice of identifying interests, managing information about capabilities and intentions, finding frameworks that accommodate the needs of multiple parties, requires participants who are operating as professionals rather than as message repeaters. A diplomat who arrives at a negotiating table with only the approved government narrative and no flexibility to engage with inconvenient information is not a diplomat. They are a spokesperson performing at a venue that functions as a negotiating table. The Russian diplomat's frustration is that the European participants at the OCE are not engaging as diplomats. They are repeating claims that Russia contests, not engaging with Russian rebuttals, and not transmitting to their capitals the kind of honest assessment that would allow those capitals to make informed decisions. This has a specific consequence for the prospects of Scenario 2. If European governments are receiving only the information their diplomatic establishments have filtered through an approved narrative, if the intelligence and diplomatic assessments reaching decision makers have been shaped by the same ideological framework that Russia characterizes as disconnected from reality, then those decision makers cannot make the accurate assessment of the situation that Scenario 2 requires. They cannot change course based on an accurate picture of where the course leads if the picture they are receiving is inaccurate. This is not a problem unique to Europe. American decision-making on Iran was distorted by exactly the same mechanism. Intelligence filtered through a political framework that could not accommodate conclusions contradicting the approved narrative. The result was decisions made on a picture of Iranian weakness that the operational reality did not support. European decision-making on Russia appears to be operating through the same filter. The narrative Russia is losing. Russian forces are exhausted. Russian escalation is bluster. The next weapons delivery will change the balance. Is the framework through which all incoming information is being processed. Information that contradicts this framework is being discarded rather than transmitted. The Russian diplomat is saying in diplomatic language, we cannot have a genuine conversation because your side is not having genuine conversations with itself about what is actually happening. The forced conscription signal and what Europe is actually doing. There is a dimension of the current situation that the comfortable Western narrative is systematically suppressing, and it concerns what Europe is actually doing to Ukrainian citizens in the name of defending Ukrainian sovereignty. Europe and the United States imposed the intensification of Ukrainian forced conscription as a condition for continued financial and military support. This is documented. The conditionality is on the record. What this means in practice is that Western governments that describe themselves as defenders of democracy and human rights, are requiring a dependent client government to compel its citizens to fight in a war under pain of apprehension and forced induction. They are requiring the lowering of conscription age thresholds. Some voices in European policy circles are advocating for the conscription of women. The Russian characterization of this, that the West is sacrificing Ukraine's entire population as a human buffer, is not propaganda. It is a description of what the policy produces. A government that conditions continued military support on forcing its citizens into military service against their will is not defending those citizens. It is using them as instruments of strategic competition against a neighbor. The citizens in question, the men being apprehended in Ukrainian streets and markets, the men whose documented resistance to conscription reflects their assessment of the war they are being forced to fight, are not represented in the Western policy discussions that are determining their fate. This is not a new pattern in how great power competition uses smaller states, but its specific application in the current context deserves the honest characterization Russia is providing, rather than the euphemistic framing that Western media typically applies to it. What comes next, and the narrow window. Let me close with the clearest possible assessment of where the current trajectory leads and whether anything can alter it. Russia has described two outcomes: military victory through conventional campaign progression, which it assesses as the more probable scenario, or a genuine diplomatic engagement that takes Russian security interests into account, which it assesses as very unlikely given current European behavior. What Russia has not described, and the diplomatic message is explicit about this, is a continuation of the current status quo indefinitely. The self-restraint has limits. The accumulated red line crossings are being registered. The decision about when the accumulated crossings require a direct response is being made in Moscow, not in Brussels or Washington. The specific trigger that Russia identifies as having qualitatively changed the situation is the strikes on Russian energy infrastructure. Targeting refineries, processing facilities, and energy production capacity is not tactical military action. It is strategic economic warfare against the Russian domestic economy. Russia's position is that this crosses a threshold that requires a different category of response than what previous escalation steps required. The Western assumption, based on the 4-year pattern of Russian restraint following each new Western capability delivery, is that this threshold will also pass without Russian action beyond rhetoric. That assumption may be correct, or it may be the final instance of a pattern whose logic Russia has decided must be broken before the next step makes breaking it impossible. The diplomat's language, the direct confrontation is approaching very much, is as clear as diplomatic language gets. He is not predicting. He is describing a logical consequence of current choices and advising that the window for making different choices is not permanently open. The question is whether anyone in a position of authority in European capitals is receiving and processing this message accurately, given his characterization of his European counterparts as propagandists rather than diplomats. Given the filter through which European decision-makers are receiving their picture of the situation, the honest assessment is uncertain. The conversation that needs to happen, the honest engagement with what the current trajectory actually produces, requires the professional diplomatic capacity that has been systematically degraded on the Western side. Rebuilding that capacity or finding alternative channels through which accurate assessments can reach decision-makers is the prerequisite for Scenario 2 becoming more likely than Scenario 1. The window is not closed, but it is not indefinitely open. This has been Global Insight Network with Colonel Douglas Macgregor. If this analysis said something that the comfortable Western narrative is suppressing, share it. Hit like. Subscribe to Global Insight Network for the strategic assessment that follows the evidence. Drop your analysis in the comments. Do you think European governments are receiving an accurate picture of where the current trajectory leads? And is Scenario 2, genuine diplomatic engagement, still realistically available? We will see you in the next